Sophie had always believed life had settled into a comfortable rhythm, mornings filled with the laughter of her 2 children, breakfast routines that felt almost sacred, and evenings with her husband, Mark, where tea and quiet conversations gave her a sense of security and belonging. Yet recently, small cracks had begun to appear, subtle shifts in Mark's behavior that she tried to ignore at first, thinking she was imagining things. He was distracted more often, staring at his phone, smiling at messages she couldn't see, coming home later, sometimes smelling faintly of a scent she didn't recognize, and when she asked him about his day, his answers were vague, rushed, sometimes too casual, as if hiding something he didn't want her to notice. And though she wanted to trust him, a tiny seed of unease began to grow inside her, whispering that all was not as perfect as it seemed, yet she didn't want to admit it, because the life they had built together, the warmth of the home, the children's laughter, and the quiet love they had shared for years, felt too precious to question, and perhaps that was why she didn't notice the way Mark's attention shifted slightly whenever Emma, their new nanny, entered the room, how his smile softened, how his voice carried a gentleness for her that Sophie hadn't felt directed at her for months, how he lingered on her words just a little longer, and Sophie, trying to be rational, told herself that it was nothing, that Emma was charming, capable, attentive, and clearly bonded with the children in ways Sophie herself had always hoped for. Yet the quiet, fleeting moments, the way Mark's eyes seemed to hold hers a fraction too long when Emma walked by, the way he chuckled at her jokes, a warmth in his tone that Sophie felt she hadn't heard in months, began to gnaw at her, and she found herself watching them subtly, noting their interactions, questioning her own mind, wondering if she was simply insecure or if her instincts were right. And despite all of this, she continued her daily routine, preparing breakfast for the children, seeing them off to school, tidying the house, and attempting to act normal, smile, and maintain the illusion of serenity. Yet every time she heard a laugh, every time she glimpsed a shared look between Mark and Emma, her heart sank with an inexplicable heaviness, a mix of jealousy, confusion, and fear that made her stomach twist, and she found herself lying awake at night, replaying scenes in her mind, imagining possibilities she didn't want to admit, asking herself questions that had no answers. And yet life continued, with Emma always present, always attentive, always cheerful, and Mark increasingly distracted, and Sophie, torn between confronting her feelings and pretending all was fine, tried to remind herself of their love, of the years they had shared, the memories they had created, and the family they had built. Yet a creeping sense of dread persisted, a whispering in the back of her mind that something was about to change, something that could shatter the life she thought she understood. And it all came to a head one Thursday afternoon, when Sophie, finishing an unexpectedly quick meeting at work, decided to surprise Mark. A simple gesture, bringing home lunch, hoping to reconnect, to spark a moment of intimacy, a smile, a shared glance, a reminder that they were partners in this life. And as she approached the front door, noticing an unusual silence, a quiet that felt heavier than normal, she felt her chest tighten slightly, a subtle premonition she couldn't quite place. And when she opened the door, stepping inside, the smell of the house seemed different, the stillness almost eerie, and she called out, her voice light, trying to mask the nervous flutter in her stomach, expecting the playful laughter of the children, the sound of Mark greeting her, maybe teasing her for coming home early. And for a moment everything seemed normal, but then a soft murmur of voices drifted from the living room, faint, almost imperceptible, yet distinct enough to make her pause mid-step, and she froze, senses heightening, heart racing. As she approached the source of the sound, a mixture of curiosity and a creeping fear urging her forward. And when she peered around the corner, the sight that met her eyes stopped her completely, left her breathless, like the air had been sucked from the room. For there they were, Mark and Emma, sitting close together on the couch, talking quietly, laughing softly, their heads inclined toward each other, a warmth in their interaction that Sophie hadn't seen directed at her in months, an intimacy that made her chest ache with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and heartbreak. And in that moment, Sophie realized that the unease she had been feeling, the tiny doubts, the sleepless nights, the moments of quiet anxiety, had all been leading to this, the undeniable, unmistakable truth that the life she thought she understood was not as she imagined, that her husband's heart, even if unintentionally, was connecting with someone else in ways that Sophie hadn't anticipated. And though she wanted to turn away, to flee, to protect herself from the pain, something rooted her to the spot, a mix of curiosity, fear, and the desperate need to understand. And so she watched silently, every gesture, every glance, every laugh cutting through her like a knife wrapped in velvet, sharp yet gentle, and she felt a rush of emotions, anger, sorrow, longing, betrayal, confusion, and an aching desire to hold on to the man she loved despite the pain. And as she quietly retreated, her mind spinning, trying to process what she had just seen, she realized that nothing would ever feel the same again, that the quiet comfort of her home had been replaced with tension and uncertainty. And yet, buried beneath the heartbreak, Sophie also felt a strange, compelling urge to confront the truth, to face whatever came next with courage. Because even if the life she knew was changing, she had to understand, to protect her heart, to fight for what truly mattered. And as she closed the door behind her, breathing shakily, the knot of anxiety and anticipation tightened, signaling that this was only the beginning of a story she was unprepared for. A story that would test her trust, her love, and her strength in ways she could never have imagined. And as she moved toward the kitchen, her mind racing with questions and possibilities, Sophie understood that life was no longer predictable, that the calm she had relied upon was gone, and that the next steps she would take would define not just her marriage but her own resilience. And somewhere deep inside, a tiny spark of determination ignited, whispering that she could survive this heartbreak, confront the truth, and perhaps find a way back to love, whether with Mark or within herself, because the life she thought was perfect had revealed its fragility. And now, nothing would ever be the same again. After the shocking sight in the living room, Sophie couldn't shake the image from her mind. Mark and Emma sitting close, talking softly, laughing in a way that felt private and tender, replayed over and over in her thoughts, like a loop she couldn't escape. She walked through the house mechanically, pretending to busy herself with chores, cleaning, folding laundry, arranging the living room, anything to stop her mind from wandering back to the couch, to the warmth she had seen between them, the way Mark's eyes had softened, the easy, natural laughter that seemed to belong to a world Sophie was no longer part of. The children ran past her, oblivious to her turmoil, laughing, shouting, and Sophie forced herself to smile, to act normal, yet every sound of their joy made her chest ache with a deep, unspoken sorrow, a realization that the home she had taken for granted, the sanctuary she had built with love and care, now held an undercurrent of tension she couldn't ignore. At dinner that night, Mark tried to carry on as usual, talking about work, asking about her day, making jokes that normally would have made her laugh, but Sophie noticed the subtle shifts, the way he avoided her gaze for a fraction longer, the nervous tension in his shoulders, the slight hesitation before answering her questions, and she wondered if he knew she had seen him and Emma together, if he felt the same awkwardness and fear that now gripped her, and she realized that trust, once broken even in thought, had the power to make everything feel fragile and uncertain. The next morning, Sophie left early for work, telling herself she needed distance, time to gather her thoughts, to understand her feelings. Yet even as she walked out the door, the image of them lingered in her mind, persistent and unyielding, a reminder that what she had witnessed wasn't simply a passing glance or innocent conversation, it was a connection, a warmth between them that she couldn't ignore. And as she drove to work, her hands gripping the steering wheel, she reflected on their marriage, on the years she and Mark had spent building a life together, on the love they had shared, and she felt a mix of sorrow and longing, wondering if the bond that had held them together could survive the subtle but undeniable breach she had witnessed. At work, she tried to focus, answering emails, attending meetings, keeping her mind on projects and deadlines, yet every notification on her phone, every ping, made her heart skip, imagining it could be a message from Mark, from Emma, or worse, from the two of them together, and the anxiety gnawed at her, leaving her restless, distracted, and exhausted, as if a storm had passed through her mind and left only turbulent clouds in its wake. When she returned home that evening, the house was quiet, eerily so, and she called out softly, expecting the children to answer, yet no sound came. And then, from the living room, she heard soft laughter again, low, intimate, and it struck her like a lightning bolt. The sound of warmth she once associated with Mark now directed elsewhere, and a wave of emotion hit her, anger, confusion, heartbreak, jealousy, all mingling, making her hands shake, her stomach churn, her chest feel heavy with the weight of something she didn't yet have words for. and she realized she was at a crossroads, standing at the edge of understanding, and whether she wanted to admit it or not, she had to confront what was happening if she hoped to save herself, her marriage, or at least her own peace of mind. She lingered in the hallway, listening, trying to calm her racing thoughts, trying to remind herself that appearances could be misleading, that perhaps it was harmless, but her heart refused to be reassured, her intuition screaming that there was more beneath the surface than she could ignore, and so she moved forward, step by step, drawing nearer to the living room, her mind a whirlwind of questions and fears, and as she approached, she caught a glimpse of them through the doorway. Mark, leaning slightly toward Emma, his hand brushing hers just as naturally as if they were old friends, yet the intimacy of the gesture made Sophie's breath catch, her stomach twist, and her chest ache in ways she had never experienced before. She felt an unbearable mix of emotions, love for the man she had married, heartbreak at the thought of him connecting so deeply with someone else, and fear for the future of their family, and yet, despite the pain, she couldn't look away. The laughter softened, voices lowered, and Mark spoke in tones that had once belonged to their private moments, a voice Sophie hadn't heard aimed at her for months, and Emma responded with ease, her presence warm, comforting, yet somehow intruding on the space Sophie had once considered her own. Sophie's mind raced as she pieced together moments from the past weeks, the lingering glances, the subtle smiles, the way Mark seemed to prioritize Emma's words, the little attentions he no longer gave to Sophie, and it all clicked into place, forming a puzzle she wished she could unsee, yet the image was etched in her memory. She realized that the emotional connection between them wasn't necessarily physical, yet it was equally powerful, equally threatening to the love she thought was secure, and a quiet rage began to simmer beneath her sorrow, a longing to confront, to demand honesty, yet tempered by fear of what answers she might receive, of what truths could shatter her world completely. That night, Sophie lay awake in bed, listening to the subtle sounds of the house, Mark snoring softly beside her, and she felt an emptiness, a distance that hadn't been there before, a space in the bed and in her heart that Emma seemed to occupy now. And though she loved Mark, she also loved herself enough to recognize that ignoring this moment would only make the pain grow, that she had to act, yet how could she act without knowing the full story, without understanding the depth of the bond she had just witnessed, and so she waited, nights filled with restless thoughts, replaying the image of them, feeling the warmth of Mark's laughter aimed at someone else, imagining the conversations, the smiles, the quiet moments that had excluded her, and with each thought, the ache in her heart deepened, until she realized that she could no longer pretend the life she knew existed was unbroken, that trust, once compromised even in small, quiet ways, could create a gulf so wide that even love might struggle to cross it. Days passed with Sophie moving through routines, attending to the children, engaging with Mark with polite smiles and small talk, yet beneath the surface, a storm raged, a silent tension that neither of them could ignore, and she noticed changes in him too. Moments of nervousness, glances she couldn't read, attempts to maintain normalcy, all of which confirmed that the sight she had witnessed had changed everything, that their home, once a sanctuary, had become a place where hidden feelings and unspoken truths lingered in every corner. And yet, amidst the heartbreak and confusion, Sophie felt a spark, a determination to confront what she had seen, to seek understanding, to reclaim a sense of control over her life and emotions, because even though love had been tested, even though betrayal in its emotional form had appeared, she knew that facing the truth was the only way forward, and as she prepared to engage Mark in conversation, the weight of anticipation pressed on her, a mixture of fear and courage intertwining, signaling that the next moment would be pivotal, that the journey of understanding, of reconciling love, trust, and human emotion was just beginning, and that the decisions she would make in the days ahead would define not only her marriage but the depth of her resilience, the capacity of her heart to forgive, and the strength to confront the unexpected complexities of love, heartbreak, and desire, all of which she had glimpsed that fateful afternoon when she walked in Unprepared, realizing that life, no matter how orderly it seemed, could shift in an instant, leaving one suspended between despair and hope, heartbreak and courage, uncertainty and clarity, and Sophie, with her heart aching and mind racing, understood that she could no longer remain passive, that she had to take the first step into the unknown, because the life she had thought she knew had already changed, and whether it led to healing, understanding, or heartbreak, she would face it head-on, determined to reclaim herself, her love, and her future. Sophie woke the next morning with a tight knot in her chest, a heaviness she couldn't shake, as if the sight of Mark and Emma together had left an imprint on her very soul, and she tried to pretend that everything was normal. But each step she took around the house reminded her of the subtle ways life had shifted. The laughter of the children, once comforting, now felt like a fragile bubble she feared might burst, and Mark's casual greetings, once warm and familiar, seemed to carry an undertone of secrecy, as if both of them were walking on a tightrope of unspoken tension, avoiding the truths that hung heavily in the air, and Sophie found herself oscillating between denial and confrontation, between the desire to shield herself from pain and the need to understand what had changed between them, because love, she realized, was no longer simple, no longer safe, no longer a gentle certainty, but a delicate, fragile thing that demanded courage, honesty, and clarity. And as the days passed, the distance she felt from Mark became increasingly palpable, like a shadow stretching over their home, coloring every glance, every word, every smile with doubt, and Sophie struggled to breathe, to function, to maintain the semblance of normalcy for the children while her mind and heart were consumed by questions with no easy answers, wondering if the connection she had witnessed was fleeting or if it had been growing quietly, subtly, in ways that she had failed to notice, and she questioned herself relentlessly, asking if she had somehow contributed to the distance, if she had neglected him, if the intimacy they had once shared had quietly dissolved, leaving space for someone else to occupy. And the guilt and sorrow weighed heavily on her, pressing down with relentless force. Yet amidst the pain, she knew she had to act, had to confront the reality of her marriage, the truth of her husband's emotions, because living in uncertainty had become unbearable, a constant ache in her heart, a silent scream in her mind that demanded resolution. And so she waited for the right moment, pacing the house, tidying rooms she didn't need to, speaking with the children gently, smiling when they laughed, yet inwardly she felt like a shadow of herself, fragmented, torn between love and suspicion, trust and fear, longing and heartbreak. And Mark, sensing the shift in her energy, tried to reach out, offering small gestures, brief touches, soft words, yet each attempt only highlighted the growing gap between them, the silent walls that had begun to rise. And Sophie, though she loved him, realized that affection alone could no longer bridge the distance. Honesty was needed, courage was needed, and she had to summon both, even as the fear of the confrontation made her tremble. One evening, she found herself sitting quietly in the living room after the children had gone to bed, the house enveloped in stillness, the soft hum of the lights the only sound, and she thought back to the moment she had first seen Mark and Emma together, the intimacy of their laughter, the warmth of his attention, and how easily it had belonged to someone else, and a pang of jealousy, sharp and confusing, coursed through her, because she realized that what hurt most was not only the possibility of betrayal but the undeniable truth that Mark's heart had wandered in ways she hadn't noticed, that someone else had become a confidant, a source of joy, a center of attention that she had once occupied without question. And the weight of that realization made her chest ache, her stomach twist, her mind spin with scenarios, questions, and fears, until she could no longer ignore the truth she had been avoiding. And she knew that ignoring it any longer would only allow it to fester, poisoning the love and trust she had built with him over the years. Yet confronting him felt terrifying, because honesty carried risk of anger, risk of tears, risk of heartbreak, risk of the very thing she feared most, loss. And so, the next morning, Sophie rehearsed conversations in her mind, imagining ways to approach him gently yet firmly, ways to speak her truth without accusation, ways to seek clarity without pushing him away. Yet each mental rehearsal left her exhausted, because she understood that words alone might not be enough, that tone, timing, and emotional readiness would all play a role, and that she could not control his responses, only her own courage and honesty. And as she waited for him to come home that evening, she felt a mix of dread and determination, knowing that the moment would be pivotal, that it could reshape their marriage, their family, and her own sense of self. And when Mark finally stepped through the door, greeting her with a tired smile, she felt the familiar flutter in her chest, a combination of love, fear, and longing, and she met his eyes, searching for signs, clues, any hint of recognition or remorse. And Mark paused, sensing the change in her demeanor, The quiet tension that spoke volumes, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them, and he realized that the truth, the conversation they had been avoiding, was unavoidable, and Sophie, gathering every ounce of courage, spoke in a voice both calm and firm, asking the question that had been forming in her mind for days, asking for honesty, clarity, the truth about the connection she had witnessed, and in that moment, time seemed to stretch, the air thick with anticipation, hearts racing, breaths held, because both of them understood that the words spoken next would define the path forward, whether toward reconciliation, understanding, or heartbreak, and Sophie felt an unexpected steadiness settle over her, a resolve to face whatever came, to confront the emotions, to demand honesty, and to reclaim her own agency in a situation that had left her feeling powerless, and Mark, looking into her eyes, saw the hurt, the love, the fear, and the determination, and he knew that half-truths or evasion would no longer suffice, that their marriage, their connection, and the trust between them hung in the balance, and so, he prepared to respond with honesty, with clarity, and with an acknowledgement of the emotional distance that had crept in, that had allowed another person to occupy the space once reserved for Sophie, and as the conversation began, hearts laid bare, truths revealed, tears and emotions flowing freely, Sophie realized that the journey of understanding, of confronting pain, of rebuilding trust, was only beginning, and though the path ahead was uncertain, though the process would be painful, though the questions might not all have immediate answers, she felt a quiet spark of hope, because honesty, courage, and emotional openness could heal even the deepest of wounds, and she understood that while the sight she had witnessed had changed everything, it also presented an opportunity to redefine love, to confront challenges, to reclaim trust, to strengthen bonds, and to discover the resilience of her heart, because love, even when tested, even when wounded, could survive if met with courage, clarity, and patience, and Sophie, as the night wore on and their conversation deepened, realized that the emotional storm they were navigating might not end quickly, might not end easily, but it had begun, and she was determined to face it fully, with eyes wide open, heart willing, and soul ready for whatever truths awaited. And she understood that the days ahead would demand all of her strength, all of her honesty, all of her capacity to forgive and rebuild, yet she also knew that this confrontation, this reckoning, was necessary, because only through facing reality could she hope to reclaim love, trust, and peace. And as she sat with Mark, their hearts raw, their emotions laid bare, Sophie felt the first fragile stirrings of clarity, the understanding that while their marriage had been shaken, the possibility of renewal existed if they were both willing to confront the past, acknowledge the present, and walk forward together with courage. And as the night grew quiet around them, the air heavy with emotion yet tinged with hope, Sophie knew that the next steps, however difficult, would define not only their relationship but also her own capacity to love, forgive, and embrace the uncertain path that lay ahead, because life, love, and marriage were never simple, and the only way forward was through honesty, courage, and the willingness to confront even the deepest pain with a heart open to understanding. And so, as the conversation drew to a pause, leaving space for reflection, tears, and quiet thought, Sophie felt the weight of the situation but also a spark of determination. Knowing that she had taken the first true step in reclaiming her life, her marriage, and her heart, and that while the storm was far from over, the journey toward clarity, trust, and renewal had begun. After the long, tense conversation that night, Sophie felt both exhaustion and a strange sense of clarity settle over her, as if finally acknowledging the truth had lifted a weight she had been carrying unknowingly for weeks, and though her heart still ached with the memory of what she had seen, she realized that facing reality, confronting Mark, and listening to his honest confession had opened a door, one that could lead to healing, to understanding, or to difficult choices she would need to make with courage. And as the following days unfolded, Sophie noticed subtle shifts in their home, moments of quiet reflection where neither of them forced conversation but instead allowed time for thought, for feelings to settle, and for the emotional turbulence to calm just enough to consider next steps. And she found herself thinking deeply about love, trust, and the human heart's capacity to stray emotionally even without physical betrayal, recognizing that while Mark had formed a connection with Emma, it was born not only from his attraction but also from a longing, a gap in their relationship that Sophie had been unaware of, and this realization, though painful, gave her insight into how love could be neglected unintentionally, how bonds could weaken quietly if not tended to with attention and care, and she understood that the first step toward healing was to rebuild connection, communication, and honesty, starting with herself and her own feelings, acknowledging the hurt, the jealousy, the fear, and yet also embracing the desire to forgive, to understand, and to reclaim the love that had been overshadowed by miscommunication and distance. And Sophie knew that she had to confront her emotions fully, allowing herself to cry, to feel betrayed, to grieve the intimacy she thought she shared exclusively with Mark, while also recognizing that love could survive these challenges if both partners were willing to be vulnerable, to listen, and to work together. And she began to speak to Mark in small, deliberate ways, asking about his thoughts, about his feelings, about the ways he had been experiencing their marriage, and Mark, seeing her willingness to engage without anger or accusation, responded with honesty, admitting times when he had felt distant, moments when he had taken her for granted, the subtle ways he had been drawn to Emma's attentiveness, and the regret he carried for allowing his emotional connection to grow without addressing the cracks in their relationship. And Sophie listened, absorbing every word, her heart aching, yet also appreciating the courage it took for him to confess. And she realized that vulnerability and honesty were the foundations they needed to rebuild, that without them, no amount of love could survive the shadows of unspoken truths. And as days turned into weeks, they began to establish new routines, small gestures that reminded them of the bond they had once cherished, deliberate moments of attention, shared laughter, quiet dinners, walks in the evening where they spoke openly about fears, hopes, and memories. And Sophie felt her heart slowly soften, the anger and hurt mingling with renewed affection, a cautious hope that things could be mended if they nurtured the trust that had been shaken. And she also acknowledged that Emma, while once a source of tension, had indirectly served as a mirror, reflecting the emotional distance that had developed in their marriage. And this recognition allowed Sophie to approach the situation with clarity, without bitterness toward the nanny, understanding that the true work lay between her and Mark. And they sought counseling together, a safe space to voice feelings, confront insecurities, and learn strategies to communicate effectively, to rebuild the intimacy that had been strained, and to recognize each other's needs without judgment. And these sessions, though challenging, became a turning point, allowing Sophie and Mark to rebuild trust step by step, to acknowledge mistakes without dwelling in guilt, and to embrace the possibility of a renewed love, deeper and more resilient than before, because they faced the vulnerability that fear had hidden. And through that process, Sophie discovered her own strength, her capacity for forgiveness, and the realization that love, when nurtured with honesty and courage, could survive even the most painful trials. And one evening, after a particularly meaningful counseling session, they sat together quietly, holding hands, feeling the warmth of reconnection, the soft comfort of shared presence. And Sophie felt tears of relief and gratitude fill her eyes, knowing that while the journey had been difficult, the path toward healing had begun, and that each small step, each open conversation, each moment of honesty, brought them closer to a love that was wiser, more understanding, and more compassionate, because they had both seen the fragility of trust and the importance of nurturing emotional bonds before they eroded. And Sophie realized that this experience, though heart-wrenching, had revealed the depth of her resilience, the power of confronting pain directly, and the profound truth that relationships were living entities, needing care, attention, and courage to thrive. And as she looked at Mark, seeing his eyes reflect remorse, love, and commitment, she felt a mixture of lingering hurt and cautious hope, recognizing that the scars would remain, subtle reminders of vulnerability and growth. Yet they could coexist with love if both chose to honor the lessons learned. And she understood that her heart, though tested, had expanded, embracing forgiveness, understanding, and the willingness to rebuild. And she allowed herself to hope, to imagine a future where love and trust were stronger than before, where communication was open, honesty was valued above comfort, and where both could grow together emotionally, spiritually, and intimately, without the shadows of secrecy. And the next morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, Sophie felt a sense of renewal, a gentle, quiet optimism that whispered she could face whatever challenges lay ahead, because she had confronted the truth, spoken her heart, witnessed honesty, and chosen to embrace healing. And in that decision, she found strength she hadn't known she possessed, a deep well of resilience, a renewed commitment to herself, her children, and to the man she loved, a promise that even when tested by uncertainty, jealousy, or emotional distance, love could endure if met with courage, patience, and vulnerability. And as the days continued, she noticed subtle shifts in Mark as well, moments of attentiveness, small gestures of care, a renewed desire to engage fully in their marriage, and these moments, though simple, became symbols of the progress they were making, building new habits, new understanding, and a renewed intimacy that acknowledged the past but did not dwell in it. And Sophie understood that, while the memory of Emma and the emotional breach would remain, it had become a catalyst, a lesson in vigilance, honesty, and commitment, a reminder that love required constant attention and courage. And as she prepared breakfast for her children, exchanged smiles with Mark, and walked through the house with a sense of purpose and calm, Sophie felt a peace she hadn't known in weeks, a balance between vulnerability and strength, sorrow and hope, and she realized that life, though unpredictable, could be navigated with grace, courage, and love, and that the path ahead, though uncertain, held possibilities for deeper connection, forgiveness, and renewed joy, because she and Mark had faced the storm together, had spoken the truths that needed to be spoken, had confronted the fears that had lingered, and had chosen, consciously and courageously, to step forward with honesty, patience, and hearts willing to rebuild. And in that moment, Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of empowerment, knowing that she had reclaimed her voice, her agency, and her capacity to love fully, to trust wisely, and to embrace the complexity of marriage with eyes wide open and heart strong. And as the evening settled into quiet reflection, she held Mark's hand, felt the warmth of their renewed bond, and whispered softly to herself that love, even when tested by heartbreak, could survive, thrive, and transform when met with courage, clarity, and the unwavering decision to face the truth together. And Sophie knew, with quiet certainty, that while the journey had been painful, the renewal of trust, intimacy, and emotional connection was worth every tear, every moment of fear, every sleepless night, because now, they were not only surviving, they were learning to love smarter, deeper, and with a wisdom born from having faced their own vulnerabilities and chosen to grow together rather than apart. And in that realization, Sophie felt a quiet joy, a gentle relief, and a hopeful anticipation for the life they were about to build, stronger and more resilient than ever before, because they had faced the storm, acknowledged the truth, and embraced the work of love with open hearts and unwavering courage. And as she looked into Mark's eyes, she saw not only remorse and regret but also commitment, love, and the promise of a shared future. And Sophie knew, fully and deeply, that they could move forward, healed, honest, and more connected than ever, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring with hearts aligned, trust rebuilt, and love renewed.